Et maman, qu'est-ce que tu dis?
Hi everyone, welcome to Fresh from the Studio, our program where women in their work, artist members share what they are working on now with you. Tonight, we'll feature Neena Buxani, Molly Valentine Dierks, and Caroline Wright with a special guest. Neena will discuss the inspiration and process behind her new series of contemporary landscapes, as well as her new abstract expressionist pieces. Molly will talk about her recent miniature landscape series and other projects that use the formal languages of nature and technology to speculate on evolving landscapes of intimacy and distance. Caroline Wright will share her latest work, which results from her return to the studio after giving birth in September. These new paintings pull in familiar themes of her work, but with a new vibrancy and urgency born of the shift in identity and time away. So the way it'll work, each artist will have 10 minutes to present their work. At the end of the presentations, we'll open it up for questions and comments for all the artists. Feel free to chat any questions you have or comments during the presentation. And then after we do the question and answers or comments, we'll move into breakout rooms where you can say hello and talk directly with the artist. We'll be in these rooms for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll wrap up and come back together, and you can share any upcoming programs and events you have, and we'll share upcoming and women in their work events. If you're ready, Molly, let's start with you.
Sure. Okay. All right, so my name is Molly Valentine Dierks, and I am an interdisciplinary artist and designer. And my work spans interactive installation, sculpture, and public art. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a background into what ties all of my different series together. So all of the sort of disparate bodies of work that I have in my practice are looking at structured alienation. So essentially, which is a term that I came up with to kind of describe the mostly white European male philosophies that we've been handed throughout the centuries in our culture that have enabled us to kind of separate ourselves from our bodies or from the environment and from one another according to gender or how we understand race, for example. And so I actually have a background in psychology. I studied psychology at Dartmouth College before teaching calculus and then Italian. So my background is very interdisciplinary. And one of my very favorite psychologists is named James Kepner, and he has a more holistic point of view when it comes to understanding how we relate to the world and to one another. And all of the different series that I have in my practice are attempting to access that more holistic point of view. So I'm just going to start with the reproduction series, which is my oldest series and the one that's still ongoing, and not what I'm currently focused on, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But the reproduction series uses the material and the formal vocabulary of post-industrial society, so mass production, commercialization, and consumption, to disrupt the binaries that I was talking about earlier. So man, woman, man, nature, black, white, etc. So this is one of the pieces or series that I did called Test Tube Babies. And this is actually cast aluminum. So I carved these wombs in sand when I was living and working in Detroit, and added cast resin and sort of dipped and poured plastic and urethane and all of these bits and like odds and ends that I had in my studio that talked about mass production. This is another piece that I mounted in Dallas a couple of years ago. And for this piece, I took all of the saved bubble packaging that I had from my studio practice, which ended up breaking down on gender lines. So for some reason, I collect baby bottle nipples. I'm not a mother, but they always end up inserting themselves into my practice. And I had some children's toys, so My Little Pony, and I think I had like an eyelash curler. And when I cast plaster and plastic and rubber into these cavities, this sort of latent sensuality of gendered products and commercialization came to the surface, which was really fun. This is Silicone Lover, which was from a solo exhibition of the same title. And for this, I was pulling from an experience that I had in Japan when I was doing residency there, where they actually sell sex toys from vending machines on the street, which I thought was really interesting. And so this is a piece from recycled sex dolls, and it's about 7 feet across. And it's really looking at synthetic substitutes for intimacy in contemporary culture. And in that same show was a series of these sort of intimate castings, these handheld objects that are called couplings. And this is directly based on my experience of going to Lowe's or Home Depot and noticing how the language of machines and this binary thinking has been mapped onto human bodies and relationships. So that, you know, for pipe couplings, pipe fittings, you have male, which always fits into female. And I wanted to disrupt that vocabulary a little bit. So this is actually male to male, female to female, nipple to nipple, and elbow to elbow. And this series naturally progressed to what I'm currently working on and currently immersed in. This is actually a studio shot that I took today. It's a lot more organized when you're in this space than it probably appears. But I have 3 different studio spaces where I live, and 2 of them are connected. And one is, at the moment, is devoted solely to categorizing all of the branches that I've been collecting. And the second studio space is a space where I can visualize bases and other materials that I'm going to use in my work. So a lot of the materials that I use in my work are actually secondhand items, so things that I picked up from the Salvation Army, with a very specific color palette. And I also work with materials that I've purchased from overseas, generally through AliExpress. And that's because there's a kind of sensuality, material and color palette that I really love and find really seductive. And one of the things that I love about this series, and part of the reason that I've turned to it during COVID, is because it allows me to get outside of my head and outside of this kind of high-speed, machine-enabled or machine-mediated culture that we have, and just get out into nature and pay attention to tiny things like little mushrooms that I collect, branches, and also pull in my background in jewelry, which is actually how I got started as an artist. So some of the details are really tiny. So you can see right here, there's my fingernail for scale, and it's very satisfying to work at that scale. So this series started when I was living in Michigan, and then I abandoned it for the sort of the security of the reproduction series. And it came back around when I was doing an artist residency in Finland. And during that residency, our phones were actually confiscated and we didn't have access to the internet. So we were just immersed in the Finnish wilderness. And during that time and that sort of incubation space, I started to collect branches again and revived this series. And I actually worked with a delightful person named Caroline McLellan, who is an Australian musician and composer. And when I came back, I mounted a show at Texas Wesleyan University called Moon Tether Bubble Raft, and it incorporated some of the work that I made in Finland, and also these wonderful sonic compositions. So each of the islands had its own sonic composition that Caroline composed, and it had sounds from nature, like birds and running water, but then it also had things like cell phone beeps and computers booting up. And then after I did that series, I did another series called There Will Come Soft Rains, which is actually a poem by Sarah Teasdale and a short science fiction story by Ray Bradbury, that both of which address a post-apocalyptic landscape of healing. So Ray Bradbury's story is primarily, or is thought to be after a nuclear war, but in both of the story and the poem, nature kind of overtakes this desecrated, or territory desecrated by human beings. And these also had sonic compositions that were ambient music composed by Carlin and computer read poems that were activated when you walked past the miniature installation. So each of these installations fits on the top of a pedestal or a plinth, and that is partly because the larger trees were just too clunky for the studio that I have at home. And So I embraced that restriction and returned to working super duper small. And so this brings me to my ongoing series, which is entitled Skin Hunger, and it's what I'm adding to this summer. So there are currently eight miniature sculptural vignettes in this series, and I'm hoping to add 8 to 10 more. Each sculptural vignette takes me about 60 to 100 hours to complete, just because all the details, because they're so tiny, I'm like drawing you in for attention. They have to be seamlessly executed, and there's a lot of strange tools that I use. So it's labor intensive, but it's also really fun. So this series also pulls from my love of reading and my love of poetry and fiction as a way of processing the world, and also my love of the wonderful stories that we have access to on Netflix and other streaming services. So this is Netherworld Sanctuary, and it's actually based on a short story by Nella Larson, who is a somewhat under-recognized female writer of the Harlem Renaissance. But for this, I was really thinking about, I began this series right when COVID hit. And so I was thinking about the entanglement between human culture and nature, and specifically the way that the medical industry both heals us and separates us from our bodies. So I have baby bottle nipples that are cut off and a syringe. And twilight sleep actually refers to this horrible, nightmarish, hallucinogenic state that women in the 1950s who were given the drug scopolamine would enter. And during that kind of weird period of being sort of asleep and sort of awake, they wouldn't remember the process of birthing their own children. And they also had to have lambskin restraint. So I just thought that was a really interesting way of handling childbirth. And so for this, I worked in some pill capsules on the pedestal. And the title of the exhibition and the ongoing series actually refers to a psychological or physiological phenomenon of like what happens to your body and your emotional and mental landscape when you've gone without touch for too long. And I actually came up with the title before COVID hit because I was thinking about how our relationships are increasingly mediated by machines. And then as COVID unfolded, it kind of put that into stark relief. And some of these details, it's difficult to tell, but some of the details are, for example, right here, these are like little rubber brush bristles. They're 1 millimeter. And so part of the fun of this, but also part of the stress, is when I install it in this space, I usually have to set aside like 5 or 6 hours with a bunch of different tweezers to put these details on the pedestal so they look like they're growing up. And this is Dream Machine, and Dream Machine is one of my favorites because it actually has a hidden hacked button-enabled bubble machine. And so when viewers walk up to the pedestal, they can press this little button and these tiny bubbles that are like a few millimeters wide come up out of the base. This is Eva and Sophie, which is based on a Netflix series that I was watching at the time that focused on a woman who had a fractured personality. So she had dissociative identity disorder. And I just was thinking how interesting it would be if we lived in a culture that kind of embraced contradiction or a fluid sense of personality or identity, gender identity, and how that might transform us in terms of understanding ourselves instead of viewing this as like a disordered perspective or way of being. These are actually thimbles. So these are these flexible thimbles, and these are bristles from a brush that I picked up in Finland. And that is it. I have one more piece that I can talk about a little bit, but some of the interactive elements, I think it's worth going to my website to see them in motion. So the Skin Hunger exhibition also included a series of trees that floated and twirled that used magnets. So there was like a little bit of space between the base and the tree itself. And for that technical effect, I was really thinking about alienation and intimacy and how we're all kind of, involved in our own worlds, but we're sort of seeking and yearning for connection. And the thing that I will end on is one of my recent public art projects, actually 2 years old now, but this was a series of signs that I did that also incorporated sonic compositions. And this is based on the poetry of Mary Oliver, which, if you're not familiar with her, I encourage you to read her poetry because it's just these wonderful meditations on nature. Yeah, so this is one of my favorite public art projects, and it is actually up in Minnesota for the foreseeable future.
Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you.
So next up is Neena.
Hi, my name is Neena Buxani, and I want to first share some pictures of my studio. On one side is a clean studio, and on the other side is a studio what it normally looks like. I usually have multiple pieces I'm working on at the same time so that it just allows me to choose what I'm inspired to work on that particular day. So I wanted to start by talking about where my inspiration comes for my work. I'm an Indian American and I was raised on the border of Mexico. So both those cultures have a lot of vivid colors and just in the decor and in the clothing and all that. And I like to bring that into my work because I feel like that's a big part of who I am. Also, I was raised in a family of jewelers, and so I was always surrounded by precious metals and gemstones and diamonds and all of that. So much so that after graduate school, I decided to become a gemologist, got a certification just because I wanted to learn more about it. Also, music and dance are a big inspiration. I was a dancer growing up, and I never played any music, but I like to listen to it. And so I feel like both those things inspire movement in my pieces. And nature is the other big one. I like to kind of study the patterns and textures and shapes that are found in flowers and animals and incorporate them into my work as well. So I want to start by talking about this new series that I started working on. And it's kind of, I've been creating my jewel paintings for a really long time and also my floral series, but I decided to kind of marry them, kind of merge them together to create this new style. I felt like it was a nice challenge and kind of exciting to work on. So to kind of understand where that's coming from, I'm going to show you my jewel series and my floral series. So these are some of the newer pieces that I created in my jewel series, and these are inspired by gemstones and crystals and minerals and precious metals as well. And I use alcohol ink to create these, and I just do a layering process, and I use brushwork as well. And so they're just kind of abstracted. And then, so these are some of my florals. These are all about 3 by 3 feet. And I like to create these using kind of non-traditional colors, just to create like a nice spin on the more classic floral paintings. And I also do a lot of layering with these. I use acrylic with these pieces, and I do a lot of layering so you feel like you can almost just climb into the flowers. And I like to do these kind of large scale to draw attention to the petals and all the things that we kind of overlook when they're on a smaller scale. So then now I want to talk about this new style. So the process behind it. And luckily I had taken these on, throughout my process, I just take pictures to see what it looks like. So I had these on my phone, luckily. So usually to start with, I choose my colors, I set up the space, I turn on some music, and I set aside some uninterrupted time. And it's helpful not to be interrupted because it will, affect the flow and the fluid part of this process. And I like to start this way because it just takes away any preconceived expectations. And it just is really therapeutic, honestly. I feel like art is a really therapeutic process. And if I'm not creating, you can tell. My husband will tell you that. And so this is just where I like to begin with these pieces. So then what I do is once they're dry, I kind of put them around my studio and I study them over the next few days. And I think, okay, what do I want these pieces? What story do I want these pieces to tell? And for these particular pieces, I said, you know what, let me incorporate lovebirds. And one of the reasons I did that is because I wanted to really experiment with the color and bring some, interesting composition to it. And also just to bring in the positivity of the lovebirds. So then the last thing that I do is I add the color blocking. And I love this part because it really ties the piece together. And I feel like I want to take the viewer on a journey throughout the piece and just kind of, have them look at every corner, every angle. And I hope to do that through adding this color blocking. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a few other pieces that I created this way. So the first step was that I did the fluid flow process. And then as you can see, the second step over there is where I started the color blocking and I decided, okay, I wanted to add birds again, but this time for a different reason. So I used primary and secondary colors in this because for some reason, those colors kept coming into my life at that time when I was creating these. And I felt like I really, really wanted to incorporate them into some of my work. And I felt like these are strong colors, these are confident colors. Let me incorporate these birds to kind of tell that, to show that. And so I chose these particular birds, one, to continue the flow of the pieces, but also you can see the attitude the birds have. So the step 3 is where I added the color blocking and all that. And I really love how these pieces kind of flow and look together. So this next piece that I created, I did it in a different order. So that's why I wanted to share it. So I knew I wanted to paint, a vase with flowers. And so I did the jewel process first, and that's how I usually do it, but I had something in mind when I did it. And so I created the vase. And then I really couldn't decide, what do I want to put in this vase? So I just sat in my studio for a couple of months. And then I had these flowers and they started wilting in my kitchen. And I thought, okay, this is exactly what I want this painting to say. And so I decided to incorporate these flowers and I changed the colors to kind of exaggerate the story that I wanted this painting to tell. And I called it A Little Thirsty. So now I'm going to talk about these contemporary landscapes that I started doing. So when I travel, like many of us, we take pictures and I'm like, okay, I'm going to paint them later. And I sometimes take them through a car window. I mean, these are just like fast snapshots. And I love visiting vineyards and wineries. And that's my favorite thing. I do that every trip we find a place to go. So I like to capture some strong feelings in each painting. And I do that through the use of color and textures and the type of paint strokes that I use. So I'm going to show you these 3 pieces and I'm going to show you the picture that they came from. So this photo was taken in Livermore, California. And I really wanted this piece to show some energy. And so I decided to go bold with the colors as usual, but in this case, I did the magenta that contrasted with the greens and I used these large brush strokes as well, because I thought that they also told the story of energetic vibes. And also, it's just something that I've been learning to do, is to be looser in my process. So, and this next one was, it's kind of special to me because this was my first trip on a plane since the pandemic started. So this was a couple of months ago, and it was really exciting. I went to go visit my sister, and we went to a winery. And this particular picture is of the private residence on the vineyard. And I really wanted to show kind of how I was feeling at that time, because it was a really exciting time. It was a very, very happy time. So I decided, let me punch up these colors and let me incorporate some oranges and really, have it be like a flowy type of painting. And so that's kind of what I wanted to tell with this one. And this last one, you can see that it was actually taken through a car window. So I don't have a really good picture here, but for this one, I decided that I wanted to do something calming, and I wanted to kind of invite, the viewer to kind of come into the painting. And so I used the calming colors, and I also created a little bit extra depth in the pathway. And so it kind of invites you to go inward. So I call this one Path to Peace. And thank you very much for listening to me. This is kind of where I display my paintings. I have a space that I invite people to come visit, but thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing your work and the process. Last but not least is Caroline Wright with a special guest.
Hi, my name is Roberta Wright, and I am Caroline's mom. Caroline has laryngitis, so she has no voice. So I will be her voice today. I'll give a tiny intro, and then the rest of the words will be Caroline's that I'll be reading from a script. I do want to say that I'm a docent at the Contemporary Austin, and I love to talk about art. So this is kind of an opportunity for me to be with Caroline, to collaborate with Caroline on this process. I also want to say something about laryngitis. It's pretty funny. It's kind of ironic and predictable. Well, a long time ago, I was a kindergarten teacher and in Austin schools, and I would get a cold frequently. And then I would get laryngitis, and I would be in a classroom with 22 5- and 6-year-olds and no voice. And I just had to figure out how to make it work. So I guess that's what we're doing today, is just trying to make it work. So now I'm turning it over to Caroline, basically. Yeah. So this is Caroline's studio, and it's in the backyard in Hyde Park in Austin. Caroline says, I built this from an old garage 6 years ago. The windows, vintage windows, were purchased on Craigslist and form a nice bank across the north side. And then we have the reliable sink and paints and storage. And all of Caroline's journals and her trusty typewriter, and a comfy nook and sort of a Zoom space. And then the rest is workspace. I'm going to show a brief slideshow of some of my work, which will take us up to the body of work that I'm showing today. I had 2 exhibitions in 2018, which capture the 2 sides of my work, as well as the collaborative aspects I like to incorporate. The first show is Backyard Love at Martine Chason Gallery in New Orleans. These paintings were an expression of the overgrowth of my garden, teeming with life, and stretching beyond the boundaries. To enhance the show, I invited a group of dancers I met while studying with Deborah Hay. I wrote a score for us to dance that included sections like Stretch to the Sun, Outgrow Your Environment, and Sing the Sunset. We performed during White Linen Night. So our audience was all in white. It made for a beautiful border to the colorful dancers moving throughout the space, singing, yelling, leaping. My friends at Nola made us headdresses too. The next show was at the end of that year and a completely different feel, although I made the paintings at the same time. These paintings feel like sound and breath. So I had the audience create a vocal composition while viewing the work. We sang what we saw, and then we sang together until it felt right to close. Then in early 2020, I found out that I was pregnant. I was in a workshop again with Deborah Hay, and these dancers were actually the first people to find out, besides my husband, Diego, because I couldn't hide how bad I was feeling. Working with Deborah gives me so much fodder for painting. It helps me hone, stretch, and synthesize how I see and how that works into the body. Movement is always my starting point for painting. I can't trust myself with paint until I'm in my body and out of my head. But the truth is, I didn't have much energy for painting or dancing when I was pregnant. I made baby quilts. This one I stitched entirely by hand for my baby. And I made drawings to express how I felt about my changing body and about birth. These help me to honor the pain, the discomfort, the fear and anxiety that came up, and harness my power for birth. And then September 9th, we had Joya. When I returned to my studio, I had a lot of energy to let loose. I gave these paintings titles that nod towards motherhood. Honey, Suckle, Restless Pinks, Swells and Rivulets, Truth on the Water, and Baby Blues. Speaking of which, I've continued to make art in my journal about the postpartum experience and about postpartum depression. Even though so many of us are mothers, it's a lonely experience. Everything is a little more raw. But there is also so much joy. At some point, I plan to make something that includes writings and drawings about this whole journey to motherhood. And let the dark and the light come out in my paintings. And you can see Caroline's paintings behind us. And they are a perfect reflection of her garden, which is radiant now with energy and new growth. So you can see all these paintings in person this weekend at Caroline's Open Studio. It's from 1 to 6 on Saturday, or Tuesday from 4:30 to 6:30. And Caroline will put a link in the chat so that you can reserve your space to come and visit her studio. You can also go on her website, which is carolinewrightart.com, and reserve there. And Caroline is also open to studio visits all the time, and you can come and see her beautiful backyard and her exciting studio.
Thank you so much. Great job. Does anyone have any questions for the entire group before we move on into our breakout rooms?
It was awesome seeing all those different approaches to nature. And also, I'm just so intrigued. I feel like at the beginning when the baby was playing with the necklace was like a perfect segue into two projects that had connection to jewelry backgrounds, which was interesting to see how those facets kind of appear in the work. No question, just observations. Any other whole group questions, or should we just jump into some breakout combos?
I want to observe too that I was so inspired and interested in the interweaving of these three artists. Caroline has been very inspired by flowers dying. I remember going to her house and seeing that she was deliberately leaving the flower in the vase when I was ready to, oh no, I'm working with that. And yeah, it was a beautiful segue among the three.
And so much good work with color too. Just a lot of really exciting color palettes happening across all of the work. Kelly's got a shout out to Caroline's mom. Yay, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cool. Well, let's jump into some small conversation groups.